think there's going to be a little bit of a lag, but it tells me we are live. Can y'all hear us?
Hello, everyone.
Hello. Hi, Christy. Hi, Christina.
We got some friends already.
Hi, Levy. Okay, y'all. Well, I'm sure you know me since we are on my channel, but I do have a guest today, and that's Tom from Tom LA Books. I'm sure many of you have found him through this entire Dante's read-along experience, and if you haven't, his channel is linked down below, and you should definitely go subscribe to him. But Tom has been doing a really interesting project around Dante this year. So, Tom, do you want to kind of explain what you've been up to?
Absolutely, and I'm honored to be here. Thank you, Jennifer, for doing this, and thanks to everyone who's watching. I've been, I think, back in December. Actually, I had this crazy idea to say, "Hey, I have a few English-speaking friends because I'm Italian. I have a few English-speaking friends who've asked me questions about the Divine Comedy because they knew I liked it. I kept rereading it, etc., and probably I kept annoying them about it. And so I said, well, why don't I try to maybe, even though I'm not an academic, I'm not a professional, etc., why don't I try to do something useful for English-speaking people and make some detailed videos, one for each canto. And then I realized that it's actually 100 cantos, so it's a lot of work. But to be honest, it doesn't feel like work at all. I'm very happy because just yesterday I uploaded my final one on Inferno, Canto 34, and so it's taken me about 5 months to cover all Inferno and come up again to see the stars. It's a pleasure for me, but it's even more pleasant and interesting to do it in a language that is not mine, and it's not the language of Dante, but with the interaction with a lot of people who love it, who really are as passionate as I am about it. And it's a completely different experience for me because obviously I was in school as a kid and I was taught the Divine Comedy in Italian, and it was all purely in Italian and the vernacular. So this has been a completely unique experience for me. So that's the gist of it. And in terms of timing, I think if it took me 5 months to do Inferno, I guess probably around beginning of next year, we should be done with Paradiso, roughly speaking.
Wow, that's a really long project, but it's really great. Tom has really incredibly detailed videos about each canto, and it's really helpful if there's one that's a little bit confusing for you. It's nice to go back to what you're doing, Tom. So, Tom, I do want to ask you about translation. Since you are Italian, I'm assuming you have read Dante in the original, and you've also read him in English. Do you feel like a lot is lost in translation when it comes over to English?
Um, so I would say there are two important points. The first point to make about the translation is that the Divine Comedy in English is a little more immediate to understand than the Divine Comedy in the original Italian vernacular, uh, uh, as for Italians. Why? Because even the best translations, and that's a completely separate conversation that we can have, but let's say the best translations, meaning the more subtle ones and the most accurate ones in English, um, tend to help a little bit the reader. I'll make a quick example. This is something I can think of is sometimes to mention your eyes, Dante will use a word that is an archaic word to say windows, and that a modern Italian person will never know what that word means because we never use it in Italy today. So you need to make that extra step, while the English translator will actually say windows instead of using an obsolete word in English to call windows, which maybe is possible, but I've noticed that no translator does that. So there is a little bit less steps or less efforts to read the English version, and so it's a little bit maybe easier from that point of view. And then the second point is, like you say, rightly so, there is and this is obvious, so I'm not saying anything new, but there is a musicality that, Dante was a full 360 degrees artist, in addition to being a scientist, a genius, and all that. But he certainly had a very, very strong sense of sound and music. And so that type of musicality that tries to mimic reality, to imitate reality. For example, you have Count Ugolino crunching with his teeth on somebody else's skull. Those noises, he tries to replicate it with a lot of R sounds and kr sounds and tr sounds and all that. Obviously, it's very difficult, if not impossible, to replicate in English.
Definitely. I can see that. That's true. Christina has a good question here. Christina from Knitting Books, etc. So, are there modern Italian translations?
Oh, that's a great question, Christina. So the technical answer is no, because there are not actual translations. What you can find today is a lot of different type of versions of paraphrases of the Divine Comedy. So even this year, for all the hundreds of initiatives that are happening still in Italy for the 700th anniversary of Dante's death, I've seen at least 10 different new Italian books that come up with a different new paraphrases of the Divine Comedy. So it's not really a translation, because we don't have somebody who put the Divine Comedy again in Italian in a poetry format. But in terms of paraphrases, so that you can read chapter by chapter as if it was a novel, yes, there are many.
I think we do a similar thing with Chaucer, maybe with the Canterbury Tales, because that's also very archaic in terms of English, using words we no longer use. So I do think there's like a kind of an updated version of that for students, like when you're in college. So that sounds very similar to
I think
things we do.
I heard Dante compared from a language point of view compared to Chaucer a lot, while, for example, something a bit more ancient like Beowulf would be too distant, right, from modern English to make a proper comparison.
Yeah, I think Beowulf's in Old English, so that's essentially, yeah, a foreign language to us today.
Mhm.
So that's really interesting. Christy, I agree. I would not have expected it to be easier in
Well,
English.
I'm,
So that is really, really interesting.
I can on that point, Christy, that I've one of the things I found in working on this project is that even personally, and this may sound funny, but in certain verses or tertine, I realized that I had been missing something in the original version that I actually now understand because I read the English translation. It's ironic and funny, but it makes sense when you think of how difficult it is for a modern Italian to properly understand every single nuance. And so if that work of translation is done by the translator, I say thank you. Now I understand what Dante meant,
That's very true. Well, I know that Tom and I have our favorite parts of the Inferno. So if any of you watching do, please let us know in the chat. Like, let us know who your kind of favorite side characters are, maybe you would call them, or your favorite instances, your favorite cantos. But I think, Tom, you and I agree. Our favorite canto is with Ugolino in Canto 33.
Oh yes, at least from a point of view of the one that, in my opinion, summarizes Inferno the most, with the most intensity, the most strength, which maybe strangely is not the final canto of Inferno, because the final canto then takes on some logistics information. But 33 is the most horrible and therefore most entertaining and powerful. It's even for a medieval sensibility that was so used to violence and physical discomfort, I think that was a little much even for them, to be honest. So that's that would be probably my favorite, if not one of my favorites. Of course, there's that. There is Canto 26 with Ulysses. That's I would say maybe the most lyrical from a lyrical standpoint. That's my favorite one, because that's where the spirit soars to the incredible heights, and these are the cantos that when you are 15 and you have no idea about life and and the world, and you're there in your Italian school, they put in front of you, and I guess if they do it well, they will put this little seed in your heart, in your mind, that then when you grow up and you're ready for Dante, you can go back to it. But in that moment, I can tell you, nobody normal likes Dante or understands Dante when they're 15. That's
I know. I wondered about that. That's a hate to love.
yes.
You kind of start out hating him, and then you come back to love him, as you do with so many things that you study in school. But I'm glad you brought up the canto with Ulysses, because you're right. It does have a very, I was going to say poetic, but lyrical does it justice. It is poetry, so it is all poetic. But the canto with Ulysses is really, really beautiful, and I think it's so interesting that this is maybe the first instance of this kind of final journey of Ulysses, that Dante made his own stamp on a huge mythological character like Ulysses. And that has now had its own kind of long reaching effects, because I think it's Alfred Lord Tennyson, maybe, who has his own poem on Ulysses that makes reference to this section of Dante. So that's a really spectacular one. And I think that does wind up being a lot of people's favorites.
I think so. And to your point, it talks really to the immense ripple effects the Divine Comedy had on world literature all around the world, from that we sometimes don't even think about, but the artists and authors and writers who love Dante and who read Dante, we don't necessarily link that, but they were impacted by Canto 26, Canto 33, and all the things that we love about the Divine Comedy, just like we are today. So his imagination has really had such a ripple effect on all of our culture. And to be fair, okay, Dante didn't completely create everything out of nothing. Okay, we need to be fair to that, because he behind every one of his incredible images and visions, generally speaking, there is always something that he's referring and referencing. And you made a wonderful video that if anybody who's watching this hasn't watched, they should go and watch, which is about the sources of the Divine Comedy. And you listed a perfect list of classic books that Dante had in his library, basically in his bookshelves, wherever he went, and sourced with no shame, starting from Ovid to Lucan to Virgil himself, obviously. All that is kind of, he squeezed out all that beauty and put it in the Divine Comedy, right? In a way that's masterful, but he didn't really. It's rare that Dante comes up with something that has never ever been imagined before. he was a synthesizer. He really had this incredible gift of being concise, and that's actually one of the things that hits me a lot, because Italian, as you know, is not a language that naturally lends itself to being concise. And even culturally, okay, I know what I'm talking about. It's we are not the most concise people, but Dante was even more than other cultures and languages are in their own language. The power of some individual lines or terzine or verses, of packing so much information in just 8 words, I am stunned still today every time I see that. It's his genius, really, and this is something that T.S. Eliot also admired in Dante. He said, "This guy can, it takes me at least 25 words to say something that he says in 4." So yeah, so that's that's something that needs to be considered, because he invented a lot of things, but really the main imaginary work that he did was to reassemble things under that used to be, for the most part, in the pagan world, under a Christian context. But to be fair, and I think you made that comment too in one of your videos, his Christian point of view, because of his strong personality, is very often coming across as Dante's point of view rather than the Christian point of view. So is he 100% Orthodox, Catholic, and Christian? There are some arguments about that, especially when it comes to Paradiso. He quotes, obviously, St. Thomas Aquinas a lot, and St. Thomas is 100% orthodoxy. But in some cases, whenever Dante doesn't agree completely with a giant like St. Thomas Aquinas, he will say that. He will make that very clear and say what he thinks. That was his personality.
Well, we have Christina is a very, very big supporter of Ulysses. And no, he did not want to go to war. Poor man. Thank you, Noah. I am really excited about Purgatory because that is my favorite canticle of the Divine Comedy.
Here
But,
too, Noah. Great to see you. It's yeah, it's almost funny, it made me think of Mark Twain. I think I was talking with Mark Richardson about it, how Mark Twain had this little saying. He said, go to hell for the company and to heaven for the climate, right? Which is so precise, and it hits at a sort of mysterious aspect of human beings, which is, why is it that we describe all the perfect things and ideal things in heaven, but really when we want to be entertained and we want to, well, what really attracts us is hell? It's I think a fair question, because out of all the cantica, even for me, my favorite one is Purgatorio. I love Purgatorio, the way it develops, the way it is, in my opinion, the real center of the Divine Comedy. But if I want to have fun, if I want to really enjoy myself, I'll go to Inferno. And I think that's why Inferno is so much more widely read than the other two canticles.
and it is really interesting. I always wonder why people really like Inferno, but it's very gory. You see a lot of really famous people, a lot of famous mythological figures, but it's very, very creative. I'm very partial to Purgatorio, but when I do want to have fun, I find myself going back to Inferno more often. And you talk about people being more fascinated with hell than with heaven. I took a course in university that was all about hell in literature, and I thought I would
Oh,
get to read Dante in it. And she says, everyone knows Dante, so we're not going to cover him. So I had to take an entire
oh,
course dedicated to Dante. But Levy has a good question. I've heard that Inferno very much influenced our modern picture of hell. Is that true? Do you know how people imagined hell before Dante's time? And that's really interesting. Tom, do you know anything off the top of your head?
Um, that's an excellent question. Actually, it kind of goes back to what we were mentioning before, the fact that Dante was not creating visions out of nowhere. He was always referring to something he had read and found. Let's also remember that Dante had a absolutely flawless memory. Whatever he read, he would remember, and not just as an exaggeration. He actually did. Um, there is what I know, the little I know about this topic, is that there were a couple of um, poetic works in the Islamic world that had been brought to Dante's attention by Brunetto Latini, who was one of his academic inspirations. And one of these in particular, which in Italian is called Il Libro della Scala, the literal translation is the Book of the Stairs, where it describes Prophet Muhammad going to a place similar to hell, etc., etc. It does have some resemblance to the overall structure of Dante's Hell, to the point that somebody many decades ago wrote an entire book claiming that Dante's Inferno is almost plagiarism based on this Islamic work. But this guy who wrote this book was bombarded with, he was destroyed by academia, basically, because, in fact, if you look into it, it's true there are a couple of faint resemblances here and there, but it's it's a very, very different work. However, to your point, there's, for example, the striking ice at the bottom of hell, where we think about fire and flames. That was one of the elements included in the Islamic work that was quoted. So you see how, or for example, another thing in the Islamic Book of the Stairs, you had a particular condemned soul who had their head twisted around their body and looking the other way, just like the hypocrites in Dante's Inferno. There are little things here and there, right? But like we said before, the most accurate way to see it is Dante is reassembling all the medieval knowledge into this perfect work of poetry, and it would be completely unfair to say that he was imitating here or there because it's so unique.
And that's something that I think still gets people, is that ice is at the very center and not fire. So that is interesting because that is still not really our modern perception of hell. Our modern perception of hell is still fire, but
Burn.
definitely that there are circles to it. I would say there are a lot of people who now believe there are stages, there are circles and different rings within hell. So that I would say is definitely Dante's influence, but you're right, there are definite relations to other works, which I think is part of what makes Dante really fascinating. Is he's one you read straight through and then you automatically start reading everything else that he referenced to get a better idea of him.
Yeah,
Krista, you're right. It's very fun.
happens in Inferno. That's so true. Yeah, because the poet's feelings, Dante's feelings, um, change obviously in Purgatory and Paradiso, and you can feel it from the tone. The tone of most cantos in Inferno is, let's call it what it is anger. Okay, Dante is very angry, fundamentally because of his personal history, because of the exile from Florence. All that he loves and cares about is in Florence, and he cannot go back there. Otherwise, they're going to burn him alive. And he's absolutely furious about it. And he writes with that type of mood and feelings. But he was also able to craft a mood and a sentiment into his poetry. So that's why in Purgatory, everything all of a sudden changes from the colors, the light, the language, the type of expressions on people's faces, and you are in a completely different world. They said that the main color, the predominant color in Purgatory is green because of the gardens, and there's a lot of green. And then once you're in Paradiso, almost in every canto, everybody is singing. There's music everywhere in Paradiso, which is an excellent way to imagine heaven, by the way. But everyone is singing. There is light shining everywhere, and that's all on purpose, so that if you really take a deep dive immersion into the Divine Comedy, you have such a chromatic difference from beginning to the end. That's people have compared the Divine Comedy to a cathedral, and I agree with that. It's an excellent comparison because it's a huge architecture. But I was thinking about this the other day, and I thought, okay, if the Divine Comedy is a cathedral, how big is the cathedral? I think you should imagine something like a mountain, a cathedral like Notre Dame, but 100 times bigger. And that's how I see the Divine Comedy.
I agree. I do too. And even though I think only Purgatory is technically a mountain, it does feel like you are continually climbing. And my favorite part of everything is that stars as the last line. Stars kind of closes out each canticle because you kind of come out again. That's a really poetic way. And Christina, you're right. Inferno is very interesting for people who are not there. I
Yeah,
think what gets me every time is that Cato is in Purgatorio. He kind of opens up Purgatorio, and Cato's a really fascinating figure. He's likely there because he was a really incredibly virtuous and honest person, actually. But you're right, there are interesting placements throughout the Divine Comedy. People show up in places you wouldn't normally expect.
yes, it's everything is arguable, right? Even in the in the previous canto of the first canto of Purgatorio, you Inferno 34, you have Brutus and Cassius in Lucifer's mouth, and the first thing you wonder is, okay, so why is Cato up there on the beach sunbathing? Why that type of fate? But Dante decided that was the way. It's using today's thought process. I'm surprised that Dante found someone to publish it. The fallout must have been amazing. Oh, very interesting comment.
Yeah, that's not something that I've ever actually given too much thought to, but yeah.
Yeah,
Particularly, I think what's incendiary to people in Inferno is with the popes, that he condemns the pope who was still alive in 1300, he condemns. Uh, and
absolutely,
that would have been quite risque.
absolutely. I mean, at that point, I think we're talking 1314, 1315, when he first, when the first versions of Inferno were published. He was already Dante. He was known as a famous poet and a big name in cultural circles, but also in a popular sense as well. So I kind of think of, for example, Galileo, who was at a certain point, in a very different way, but so popular and culturally powerful that he got to a point where he didn't care too much or worry too much about what he was saying. I don't think that's exactly the case for Dante, because he did have to worry about what he was saying in the Commedia. But there is the added element of the exile, the fact that from his point of view personally, he had already lost more or less everything that he had to lose. And so that is a blessing and a curse. It's a blessing for us because he didn't have restraints. And it was a curse for him, unfortunately.
That's true. I thought this was quite funny. I suppose the peak of hell for someone from a desertic region is to end up in an icy surrounding. And that's, yeah.
It's so true. It's so true. That's why somebody writing from Middle Eastern regions and Islamic locations would probably have thought about that for sure. And then there's also a comparison to the warmth of the sun, the warmth of God's embrace, and the good feeling overall that something warm gives you, versus whenever you are alone and feeling of loneliness and interior loneliness that tend to be associated a bit more with cold rather than warm. So there is a maybe a spiritual accuracy there as well.
Yes, because I think people who are not Christian are often shocked to learn that there's very little information about hell um, in the Bible, and that fire actually is a little bit of kind of a construction that's not always rooted in scripture. There are definitely references to it, but I think people often picture fire because it is so extremely painful. That's really the one thing we know everybody fears is fire. But I think there is kind of a more modern interpretation that hell is God's absence. And so that does seem very chilling, very cold, very lonesome. And so maybe that's partially what went into this here. But I do think kind of ending in ice, that's often a very shocking thing for modern readers because we do have the conception of hell as fire.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, the striking image of the worst of the worst sinners, the ones just surrounding Lucifer in Dante's Inferno, who are encased in ice, and they cannot even speak because no part of their body is free to move. So they're almost statues encased in ice. That's something that in itself was Dante's invention. So Christie is saying, imagine that there are different levels of hell, and that Virgil is not in the ice. Absolutely, absolutely. The various degrees were something that Dante visualized so in a way that probably was never visualized as well before. But you can also take the Divine Comedy as a whole and really look at it and read it purely as a philosophical treatise, purely as a theological, because what is doing is taking Aristoteles and St. Thomas Aquinas and put them into a movie, if you want to say, in a vulgar way. Yeah, I cannot even imagine how to start, but that's something like someone like Dante was able to do it, to take very complex philosophical concepts that in themselves had already all the different degrees of seriousness and degrees of sins and virtues, and make them visually immediately understandable to everybody, including us poor mortals who are just who are so visual and we need images to understand things.
And I think, Christy, you also kind of speak here to a point that I've seen people struggle with, especially in the Discord server for the read along. And I'll also link to that down below if I remember to do it. But that people think that it's kind of hard to believe anybody reached salvation because of what kind of petty things people are condemned for in Inferno. I think specifically people struggled with lust. that people were in the circle of lust rather than deeper down or rather than in Paradiso. And so it is comforting to know that there are different levels and things do get progressively worse. And I think, like Dante starts out very, Dante in the poem, Dante as the pilgrim, starts out very sympathetic to people and very appalled by the nature of the punishment of most of the sinners. But as it goes on, sometimes he'll get on his high horse and say, well, this is where you need to be.
Yes.
So,
Yes, absolutely. He learns. He learns a lot. Um, and it's so fascinating, the character of Virgil, because Virgil almost takes a little bit of a bad rep if you look at the Divine Comedy as a whole, because Virgil, the incarnation of reason, the incarnation of the pagan world, at a certain point, he has to go. He has to give way to theology and love and everything that is beyond rationality. But the importance of Virgil, I mean, even until the very end, Dante has this. He feels great support in Virgil, and he loves him, not only as a poet, because obviously he loved him as a poet, but he expresses that love for what Virgil impersonates and incarnates. Sometimes we think of Virgil as because he starts stumbling, Virgil, pretty quickly, right? In Canto 6 or 7, he starts making his first mistakes. The demons are laughing at him and they're mocking him. And he's like, well, where am I here? I'm not from this world, I'm from a pagan world, completely different. And he doesn't come across as an invincible Superman at all. Um, but there is a good balance, I think, and overall, at the very end, in that beautiful scene, I think towards the end of Purgatory, where they say goodbye, that is a very, very moving scene. Very moving.
yeah, that's my favorite part of the entire Divine Comedy. And I really love Virgil. And you hit on something with Virgil that I think was also an interesting point that people brought up in the Discord server, which is the name dropping. There are a lot of really famous people in the Divine Comedy, but also I've heard this before. I'm sure you've heard it too, Tom. And it's a little bit disparaging, which is that Dante is essentially writing his own fan fiction. He gets to be led around by his favorite poet. He gets to meet the girl that he loved who died young, and he gets to meet all the greats of all time. And the greatest poets welcome him in as one of their own. I really like the name dropping aspect of it. I do think that makes this fun, but I can see that it could be irritating to the first time reader, but the fan fiction aspect, in a way, I guess it's true. But I feel like it's a little bit disparaging to call it that to me because this goes far beyond him getting everything that he wanted in a fictional sense.
100%. It's true as long as you remember the multiple layers that Dante included in the Divine Comedy, right? It's at least 4 or 5 different layers, if not more, of meaning. And so at the very superficial one, or the literal layer, yes, you can say it's fan because it's personal. But the way I tend to see it, and it's maybe my personal opinion, is that every book of fiction that I've ever read, the best ones, the most intense and moving, and my favorite ones, have always been books where the author was putting herself or himself in what he was writing or she was writing. Meaning, um, there is, they haven't invented yet, I think, a way to surpass the feeling of immersion and intensity that you get when an author talks about things that are personal, directly or indirectly. It doesn't need to be biographical. That's not what I mean. But as long as the author is talking about something that is very close to their heart, that's the way to write the best works of literature. That's my point. And so my opinion is that Dante did that. He said, okay, in order to get the best out of my literary skills, I'm going to speak about what I feel, what I think, my people I hate, people I love, and I think it absolutely worked. We also need to remember that there is a little bit of a stereotype of that I found, on comments online, etc., which is he wrote this to take revenge. He wrote this to. That is not fair because, first of all, 95% of the people that he talks about in a negative way had already died. Most of them before 1300, in fact, even 1290. Only a few exceptions were still alive when he published Inferno. It's not many. It's maybe a handful of people. And so, what are you taking revenge if they already gone? Maybe on their families, but it doesn't convince me.
And what you said about it being very personal and an author putting themselves in their work, people also find it difficult to find any real for sure information about a lot of Dante's life because of the time in which he lived. But I think you come away from the Divine Comedy knowing Dante and knowing him in a way that sometimes a biography can't help you with, because there is definitely a difference between Dante the Pilgrim, Dante the character in the poem, and Dante the poet. But there's enough similarity, especially when you see how he reacts to certain people, to certain characters. I think you definitely get a sense of Dante as a person.
Yeah, 100%. Let's put it this way, okay? We don't know how Dante looked. All the different impersonations, the paintings, statues, they're only hypotheses. We don't know how he looked. We only have a description by Boccaccio, where he says that he had a long face, big chin, big nose, but many Italians do, to be honest. At the same time, if, like you say, if you were put in a room, almost like this suspects room, right? And you were there with 5 men, and you just had a chat with each of them, and one of them was Dante, like you say, you would know who that guy is. You would spot,
Hmm.
right? Because after having read the Divine Comedy, because you get inside and out of his personality, and you feel like you know him 100% at the end, which is not all positive. We all realize that he was probably an unbearable guy to be near, but no one is perfect.
That's why I would never want to meet him. People often say, "Who would you invite to dinner? Your favorite historical figure?" I said, "Never Dante." I do not want to meet him. I don't want to be
With him.
disillusioned. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, it is so beautiful. It is so brilliant, Levy. The fact that star winds up being the last line of every canticle. And so much of Dante's genius is summed up in that to me.
Yes, I I completely agree. There's um, this other thing from a architectural point of view that I love so much is how he put some kind of codes in his, and the stars is one of these codes. The last word of each cantica is stars, stelle. Another one that I can think of is ruina, which means um, when the rocks crumble down. And in Inferno, he uses this word. I myself actually discovered this thing only a few months ago. He uses this word only 3 times in Inferno, and each time is to indicate the 3 places in Inferno where some rocks or some bridge had fallen down and crumbled down because of Jesus Christ's descent into hell. And these non-coincidences, the fact that he indicates the presence of Jesus with the number 3 because he repeated the word 3 times, and 3 was the perfect number indicating the Trinity and the divine presence. Really excite me because he built it almost as a puzzle. There is almost a playfulness about it, behind it.
That's a video I'm planning is on numerology, numbers in Dante, because 3 and 9, 3 of course is 3 times 3 equals 9, so like an extra perfect number. And then 7 also pops up a lot. That's kind of a biblical number. There are a lot of biblical numbers in Dante, and that just shows you there was a lot of, I mean, a lot of thought put into it. Everything seems to have a place within the poem. Nothing is wasted. Like you said, he's very succinct. He gets to the point, and so nothing is wasted.
Oh yeah, oh yeah. I, even trying to explain when I sometimes make a video, and I find myself explaining a verse, I have to edit and delete at least 5 minutes of myself talking because I'm not succinct like he is. But so when it comes to Paradiso, as you were mentioning before, Jennifer, in your taste or preference, do you have any parts or cantos or just even images that you prefer, that are highlights for you?
In Paradiso or in Inferno? I do. Did we say in Paradiso? I'm sorry. I
Yeah.
think I cut out. Yeah, Paradiso is a really interesting one, and people really struggle with it. But I love so much when he and Beatrice kind of leave off.
Oh yeah.
I think the parts where people are leaving when he kind of leaves these big characters behind. There's a lot of emotion in them, and Christy kind of said this here. It is shocking, viscerally visual. And you're right. You see these scenes, and particularly scenes like that with Beatrice, with Virgil, with the punishments, of course, here in Inferno, you see it most spectacularly. It's hard, I think, to visualize poetry often, but this is a very, very visual work. You can easily see everything that he says.
uh, Absolutely, I completely agree. There is a I remember actually the first time I reread Paradiso. Maybe I was 25 or 6 or something, and I I couldn't remember what it was about. And reading the first few cantos, where Beatrice takes Dante by the hand and they start flying, and it takes a while for Dante to realize that he's actually taken off, that he's flying, and then they hit towards the moon, and because of the science of the time, they thought that the moon was made of a material that you could move through, and so they move through the moon. I see that as a wonderful example of science fiction. What we call today science fiction. The fact that he goes into the explanation of the lunar, how do you call it in English? The dark spots on the moon. There is a part where he talks about that. So if you like that type of approach to things, that the poetry is open to any aspect of human knowledge, including science. um, I think that's where Dante is going, and there's a lot of that in Paradiso.
That's another of my favorite parts. That's also one of my favorite art pieces of all time is Botticelli's sketch of Beatrice and Dante flying through the stars, through the constellations. It's beautiful. I will link to it down below if you haven't seen it, but I think Botticelli never made a mistake in his life. This
Which the poem is so good that it would be an honor to be mentioned wherever you ended up. That's so true. Oh yeah, yes, yes. Even if you are down in the pits, right? They say, "Oh yeah, that's my name. I love it."
that's fame. That's fame for all time. There's a lot of talk about fame and the Divine Comedy, but it's interesting. Certainly, there are a lot of people in this. I wonder, like, about Paolo and Francesca. Would we know anything about them had he not kind of immortalized them in Inferno?
Yeah, and sometimes people ask, how can somebody be so arrogant to assume that his work is going to last forever, like Dante did? I don't know. I don't know. I mean, he was just aware of his genius, and I mean, to be fair, he wasn't the only one. I think there are other literary geniuses who were of that opinion about themselves, but in his case, that was pretty strong.
Tom, in Italy, which part of the Commedia was assigned for you in class? Or did you read all of it?
Right, great question. It's there is an arbitrary selection or anthology of cantos that Italian students get exposed to because it's impossible for time reasons to do it all. And I can tell you that usually you always do canto for Inferno, canto 1, 2, 5, Francesca, Paolo, Francesca. You do Ulysses 26 for sure, probably Canto 10, 6 with the poets, and that's pretty much, and then the last one, the 34 and 33, Ugolino. That's pretty much it, what you get in schools. Then, if you progress and go forward, you do maybe 2 or 3 from Purgatorio and 2 or 3 from Paradiso. And that's it, which is not enough to get a proper sense of what he was doing with the entire work.
I'm worried about everyone with Paradiso because that's one that does lose a lot of people. Tom and I were talking about this a bit before we went live. Uh, Paradiso is a very philosophical, abstract, you might almost say, part of the Divine Comedy. And speaking of visualizing, I think that one is potentially the hardest to visualize. Everything is circles. God is a circle. Everyone is around you in a circle.
You're so right. There is no points of references or everything is suspended up in the air. And I think T.S. Eliot, when commenting on Paradiso, he said that what shocked him was that before reading it, he didn't think that it was actually possible to put philosophy into poetry or theology into poetry. He just didn't think that the two could go together, and then he realized that Dante had done it in by using images, by using visuals. If you think about the huge fire eagle in the sky that's formed by all the souls, for example. So there is a lot there that it makes me laugh almost. I'm thinking once I'm at Canto 33 of Paradiso, it's just going to be me talking to my phone. That's what I'm afraid of. But I hope it's going to be more. It's going to be more entertaining for other reasons. I don't know. I'll try to make it entertaining.
Yes, you've made it this far. You might as well complete it. That's my motto. Paradiso can be hard. Uh, oh, UK. Lee did recommend this to me the other day, Marco Santagata's work about the historical background and political unrest at the time. This is very true. I'm trying to plan a video on that right now, and it's very complicated. The Guelphs and the Ghibellines,
Oh
the
my!
white Guelphs, the black Guelphs.
Oh, it's back and forth. Almost every couple of years, one was out, the other was in, the other was out. It's hard to keep track with that type of history.
Yeah, Christy. God is a circle.
I have something so interesting that I read about that concept. I was reading a book about astronomy by an Italian physicist, and all of a sudden, he starts quoting Dante. He starts quoting the final canto of Paradiso, where, in the opinion of I'll probably talk about it separately whenever we talk about Paradiso, but in the opinion of this physicist, Dante, through Brunetto Latini and other academics of his time, had theorized something that is very close to quantum reality for what modern physicists are trying to work around today.
Wow.
And 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 in this book, this physicist is trying to demonstrate it. I tried to follow the explanation because it was not an easy one to follow, but it's not impossible. It's not impossible that they already had some intuitions about things that our physics have not completely understood yet. If 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 he was talking about the center of gravity and Virgil and Dante flipping 180 degrees around Satan, there is a lot of our physical world that we haven't, that we assume wrongly they couldn't understand back then, but that's not exactly right.
And Christina's right too. Trying to visualize God is difficult. And there's also some of that there too. But, that God doesn't appear as a man, I think was a pretty interesting choice, probably because trying to put a face on God would be a very difficult thing to do. But, the circles, you're right. That's really interesting about kind of quantum physics and everything. But, there's so much to circles. There is no end, there is no beginning. That's also uh, very Christian ideal of God. There is no end, there is no beginning.
Yeah. I think I shared with you about this concept, the fact that my maybe most personal and intimate view of the Divine Comedy is, under the Christian standpoint, is this constant build up from Canto 1 to Canto 100 towards the highest spiritual peak, which, yes, of course, is the almost union with God that Dante achieves at the very end, but just before it, the prayer to Mary, and how that prayer, uh, to me, is moving every single time I read it, and it's a reinterpretation of the Hail Mary under in poetry format, in his terzine format, that seems to be the culmination for me of everything else, of is the goal where he was directed to, especially because all Dante's journey has been wanted by Mary, if we remember from Virgil's explanation in the beginning, right?
So you kind of read everything as a crescendo to the prayer, almost as part of the prayer itself.
I,
That's really fascinating.
I do, and it's a completely subjective view. I realize, but I love to see it that way. So, I hope that we are giving people the idea that, hey, there is a lot of fascinating stuff in Purgatory and Paradiso as well. Don't go away.
Yes. Purgatory is really fun. Purgatory is very, very creative. But people will be with you, Tom, there at the end. Lee says, no worries. I will be there, Tom. Christina as well. And shelf starters. Good. Stick around. There's a lot of interesting things coming. Yes, please come to our Purgatorio live show. I'm going to bug Tom until he agrees to do it with me again. So you might get sick of seeing me and Tom, but we love Dante and we just want to talk about him all the time.
I told Jennifer that we are already applying for her honorary citizenship in Italy. I think the mayor of Florence is looking at the papers right now as we speak.
Oh, how good. That would be the dream. Well, thanks, Tom, for coming on today. I think we're running a little short on time, but thanks everyone for coming. I hope that you really enjoyed Inferno, and I hope too that you will stick around with us for Purgatorio. If you're not following Tom, definitely go subscribe to Tom and watch all of his videos on Inferno, because you're now wrapped on Inferno, right? You've done Canto 34.
Yes,
So,
yes, we're starting with Purgatorio next week. Great pleasure to have this chat with you, Jennifer, and hopefully the first of many.
yes, I hope so too, Tom. Thanks, everyone, and thanks again, Tom, for coming. Thank you, Lee. That was very kind.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.